Good morning, everyone. I'm Tiffany Vasquez, and I'll be presenting on merchandise trade statistics for the period January to May of 2021. The first half of this presentation focuses on imports for the stated period, whilst making comparisons to the same period in 2020. Thereafter, we will look at our domestic exports, analyzing their performance during that period, and then finally, we will wrap up with an overview of how these commodities performed in foreign markets. For the period January to May of 2021, Belize's imports were valued at $760.2 million. Imports grew by a notable 10.2%, or $70.3 million when compared to January to May of 2020, where imports totaled almost $690 million. One should note that this spike simply signals the return to normal import flows, as these figures are a comparison to the record low imports of last year, where imports for the months of April and May in particular hit historic lows owing to the challenges brought upon by the COVID-19 pandemic. Having said that, imports seen across a few commodity categories were strikingly large. For example, imports of manufactured goods and other manufacturers rose by 45%, up $33.9 million to almost $180 million, due mainly to increased imports of construction materials such as steel pipe piles, cement, and corrugated steel rods, along with surveying equipment and prefabricated buildings. The beverages and tobacco category more than doubled over the period, rising by $19 million to $37.2 million, largely due to imports of beer meant for re-exportation. Imports of chemical products went up by 1/4, or $16.3 million to $84.5 million, as the country purchased more fertilizers, diagnostic testing kits, and biodiesel over the period. The machinery and transport equipment category, on the other hand, saw a relatively smaller increase, up by $4.5 million to $144.9 million, owing to increased purchases of food processing machinery and their parts, along with tractor trucks. The categories of crude materials and mineral fuels and lubricants also saw comparatively smaller increases, each growing by $3 million over the period, while boosted imports of treated pine lumber and used clothing prompted the increase in the crude materials category. Higher prices for fuel led to the uptick in the mineral fuels and lubricants category. And with greater purchases of grocery items, such as condensed milk and coffee creamer, the food and live animals category grew by 2%, or almost $2 million to $96.9 million. However, not all commodity categories saw greater imports over the 5-month period. Imports into the commercial free zones dropped by 10%, or $10.2 million to $95.1 million. For despite increased imports into the free zones within the past 2 months, purchases of bags and clothing fell substantially over the period. And finally, with decreased imports of cooking oils, the oils and fats category declined by almost $2 million to $9.2 million. Now moving on to domestic exports. For the period January to May of this year, total domestic exports amounted to $172.2 million. This was a noteworthy increase of 15.5%, or $23.1 million over the exports for that same period last year. While earnings from marine products and bananas grew slightly over the period, it was sugar and animal feed that were the main drivers of this overall increase, an increase which masked decreased revenues from citrus products, red kidney beans, and black-eyed peas. Sugar saw the largest increase, with earnings from this commodity growing by 1/3, or $15.6 million to $61.9 million, as exported quantities of sugar grew substantially by 41%, owing to increased production and earlier shipments of bulk sugar. Export revenues from animal feed more than doubled during the period, as a good corn crop, coupled with rising prices for corn-based products driven by global demand, resulted in earnings from animal feed going up by $6.9 million to $11.5 million. Earnings from marine products grew only slightly by $1.7 million to $13.9 million, as increased sales of conch were offset by decreased exports of whole lobsters, lobster meat, and shrimp. Bananas saw a marginal increase, up by $0.7 million to $36.9 million. Now, from among the commodities that experienced decreased earnings during the period, citrus products were among the most notable, as citrus earnings fell by $3.7 million to $17.9 million, due largely to reduced exports of orange concentrate. Red kidney beans saw a similar decrease, falling by $3.5 million, down from $10.1 million to $6.6 million, a sharp decline resulting from the fact that March of last year saw extraordinarily large shipments of red kidney beans as the COVID-19 pandemic led to panic buying of this product on the world market. And lastly, earnings from black-eyed peas declined by $1.4 million to $2.4 million. So with this marked increase in overall exports over the period, how did we perform on the world market? As one would guess, sugar had the greatest influence. Earnings from the European Union grew by $19.9 million to $44.9 million on account of greater sugar exports. But likewise, earnings from the United Kingdom fell by $3.4 million as sugar exports to that country declined over the period. The period's other notable mention, animal feed, was the primary contributor to the increased earnings seen from Central America, where revenues from the neighboring region grew by more than 60%, or $8.6 million to $13.5 million. And with increased exports of conch, revenues from the United States of America went up by $3 million to $26.5 million, while reduced exports of red kidney beans largely contributed to the decline in earnings from other countries, where revenues from all other countries combined dropped by $4.1 million to $6.6 million. For the period January to May of 2021, imports totaled $760.2 million. This was an increase of 10.2% when compared to imports for that same period in 2020. Imports of manufactured goods, other manufacturers, beverages and tobacco and chemical products all grew significantly. For exports, total domestic exports amounted to $172.2 million. This was a growth of 15.5%, largely due to increased exports of sugar and animal feed.